Evan Corrin didn't even let me sit down. He slid a termination packet across the conference table, tapped it twice with his finger, and gestured toward the door like I was a catering mistake that had wandered into the wrong room. "Pack your things after this," he said flatly. "We're done with you." The executive team sat frozen. No transition plan, just public execution in a quarterly strategy meeting. Then he added, almost amused, "Fiona, we need forward energy. You're slowing us down. Go back to that room." For a second, I just stood there, wondering whether it was the air conditioning or the moment itself that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. Speaking of cold, it's freezing where I am right now. What's the temperature where you're listening from? And if you're still here with me, drop your lucky number in the comments. I have a feeling we're going to need a little luck before this story's over. 2 seats away, his son Ethan Corrin, 27, fresh MBA. 0 filed disclosures, leaned back in my chair. My chair. He gave me a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile people wear when they've inherited something they didn't build. He spun a pen between his fingers, like he'd already mastered the company's financial architecture. Ethan had never signed a quarterly revenue certification. He had never negotiated a covenant. He had never been questioned by an investor about material risk exposure. But today, apparently, he was the future. I was Senior Revenue Risk Director for 14 years. I oversaw 4 strategic contracts worth $212 million annually, 37% of total revenue. My signature sat on 6 consecutive years of investor disclosures, tied to our largest equity partner, who controlled 62% of company ownership. Evan waved a hand dismissively. "Old structure thinking," he said. "It's just paperwork?" No, it wasn't paperwork. It was regulated disclosure filed under my name documentation that triggered a 72-hour reporting obligation the moment a key signatory changed. I watched Evan sign my termination without hesitation. Replacing competence with bloodline in a single stroke of ink, the room saw a promotion. I saw a clock start ticking. What you've just heard is emotionally true. The rest of this story will weave in dramatized elements and carefully crafted details, some shaped with the help of artificial intelligence, to illuminate the lessons beneath the surface and the emotions we don't always say out loud. I hope that something will resonate with you. And if it doesn't, that's okay too. Maybe tonight is simply a good night to rest and protect your peace. By noon, I officially stopped existing. At 11:42 a.m., Evan sent the email to the entire company: leadership transition completed. No acknowledgement of 14 years. No mention of revenue oversight. Just a clean, corporate obituary written in 12 words. Within 2 hours. My access was revoked, my profile removed from the executive directory, and my name erased from the internal governance dashboard. It was efficient, surgical, almost impressive. At 1:57 p.m., Ethan Corrin appeared in my former slot under Strategic Revenue Oversight. The title looked heavier than he did. Humiliation is quiet. It doesn't scream. It burns slowly while people avoid eye contact in hallways. My phone stopped buzzing. My calendar emptied. I could practically hear the company convincing itself that nothing essential had changed, except something had. Because while my name disappeared from the internal system, it still sat in the external filings submitted to our largest institutional investor, Fiona Turner, critical revenue signatory. That designation wasn't decorative. It was attached to 4 strategic contracts worth $212 million, annually 37% of total revenue. Under securities compliance rules and our investor agreement, any change in key personnel tied to material revenue required disclosure within 72 hours. Evan knew that. He chose not to act. I later learned he told the CFO, "No need to create market noise," as if regulatory disclosure were optional, like updating a LinkedIn headline. The logic was simple: delay the filing. Avoid scrutiny. Let Ethan settle into the role before anyone noticed. But governance doesn't run on optimism. By 3:30 p.m., a member of the Audit Committee sent me a direct message. "Are you still employed?" One sentence. No greeting. I answered with one word. No. There is a particular kind of silence that follows truth. It stretches. It recalculates. The humiliation shifted into something steadier, contained, controlled. I wasn't angry yet. I was observant. I knew exactly how the 72-hour clock worked. I also knew the quarterly revenue certification was due the following morning. What I didn't expect, what even I found reckless, was the timing. Before any disclosure had been filed with the investor group, before any formal risk reassessment had been conducted, Ethan had already signed the quarterly certification, stating there was no material impact from leadership changes, no transition memo, no risk analysis, no documented evaluation, just ink. He signed it under the authority I once held. And the moment he did, humiliation hardened into something colder. Because now this wasn't about replacing me, it was about misrepresentation. The problem wasn't that Ethan replaced me. The problem was that he signed. By the next morning, I received a forwarded copy of the quarterly certification through a contact who still trusted me more than the new leadership narrative. There it was in clean digital ink beneath the compliance statement, Ethan Corin, authorized signatory. The certification included one critical sentence. No material risk impact from leadership change. I read it twice. There had been no risk review, no transition memo documenting knowledge transfer, no internal impact assessment, no certification trail confirming Ethan had been trained on revenue exposure modeling. The language he approved implied that someone had evaluated the financial and regulatory implications of my removal and determined there was none. No one had. Evan had pushed the report forward anyway. I could imagine the conversation clearly. File it now. He would have told finance, we don't need delays, speed over scrutiny, optics over governance. At first, suspicion felt personal. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they had quietly conducted a review without informing me. But strategic contracts tied to investor covenants don't move quietly. Any legitimate assessment would have required documented analysis of exposure thresholds, contingency protocols, and key personnel continuity. That documentation didn't exist because I would have been asked to produce it. Instead, the filing went out early, by early afternoon. The institutional investor group began asking questions. They weren't dramatic. They were precise. Their compliance analysts compared publicly visible information against formal filings. My LinkedIn profile had updated. The company's executive page had changed. Internal HR records reflected my termination date, yet the official key person disclosure listing me as critical revenue signatory had not been amended. Those discrepancies don't hide well. An email was sent to the CFO clarify change in key person oversight, short, direct, measured. I imagined the room when that message arrived. Finance scanning attachments, legal checking timestamps, Evan insisting it was administrative. He replied quickly, internal restructuring, no impact. That sentence mattered. It wasn't a hallway comment or a verbal assurance. It was written confirmation sent to a controlling equity partner who owned 62% of the company. A formal statement asserting there was no material effect from replacing the executive responsible for overseeing 37% of revenue. Suspicion faded. In its place came something steadier. I began mapping the timeline. Termination on Monday morning. Certification signed Tuesday. Disclosure still unfiled. Investor inquiry Wednesday. Each action stacked neatly against the 72-hour regulatory window. Not malicious, just careless. And carelessness in fiduciary reporting carries weight. I didn't call anyone. I didn't warn anyone. Strategic calm is quieter than anger. I understood something Evan didn't once an investor questions continuity in revenue oversight. The burden shifts to documented proof. Assurances don't resolve discrepancies. Records do, late that evening. Another message came through from my audit committee contact. Emergency session requested. Within 24 hours. That wasn't routine. Audit committees don't convene urgently over minor paperwork. They convene when written representations conflict with compliance obligations. I closed my laptop slowly. This was no longer about humiliation or pride. It was about documentation. And documentation, unlike loyalty, doesn't bend for nepotism. By the time the 72nd hour arrived, the silence inside the company felt heavier than any headline could have been. Exactly 72 hours after my termination, our largest institutional investor issued a formal notice. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was clinical. 37% of revenue subject to material reassessment pending verification of key personnel continuity. That was the entire message. No accusation, no demand for repayment, no declaration of default. Just 3 words that make markets uneasy under review. Nothing had technically vanished. The contracts were still active. Clients were still paying invoices. Revenue projections remained unchanged on internal dashboards. But investor confidence doesn't operate on hope. It operates on continuity and documentation. When 37% of annual revenue is tied to a named executive, and that executive disappears without timely disclosure, reassessment becomes inevitable. The market reacted quickly. The stock dropped 6% in a single day. Not a collapse, not a panic. Just a measurable vote of concern. Inside the company, tension escalated in quieter ways. Evan called an emergency leadership meeting, according to someone still willing to text me updates. He opened with forced calm. "This is procedural," he said. "Investors are validating continuity." Procedural? As if revenue reassessment were a scheduling adjustment instead of a governance warning. One board member didn't accept that framing. "Did we file disclosure within the required time frame?" she asked. The room reportedly went still. The answer was not complicated. The disclosure amendment reflecting the change in key personnel had not been submitted within the 72-hour window mandated by our investor agreement. My termination had been immediate. The certification had been filed. The disclosure had been delayed. Evan attempted to soften it. We were aligning documentation before creating unnecessary volatility, which, translated, meant we chose optics over compliance. Directors rarely react with visible emotion. They calculate exposure. A 6% dip can recover. But documented delays in material disclosure invite regulatory scrutiny, and scrutiny lingers. While leadership debated narrative strategy, internal systems did what they always do: preserve records. Someone in finance forwarded an email thread to the audit committee. In that thread, dated the afternoon of my termination, Evan had written to the CFO hold the disclosure until after certification. No need to create market noise. There was no ambiguity in that instruction. It was explicit. Delay the filing. Prioritize the certification externally. Ethan had signed a statement declaring no material impact. Internally, the CEO had directed a postponement of required disclosure. That contrast mattered. The investor's notice now read less like routine verification and more like a consequence of inconsistent representations. Audit committee members received both documents side by side, the formal investor communication, placing 37% of revenue under reassessment, and Evan's directive delaying disclosure. Tension shifted from market optics to fiduciary accountability. The contracts themselves were stable. Clients had not withdrawn. Performance metrics remained strong. The risk was not operational. It was governance. For the first time, the discussion was no longer about me. It was about intent. Evan had believed delaying disclosure would prevent panic. Instead, it created a time-stamped record, suggesting awareness of the reporting obligation and a conscious decision to postpone it. In corporate governance, that distinction is everything. The stock could recover. The contracts could survive review. But documentation, once surfaced, does not negotiate. And now, the paper trail was circulating among people who did not answer to Evan Corrin. Denial is louder than panic. And Evan Corrin leaned into it. Within 24 hours of the investor notice, placing 37% of revenue under reassessment, he retained a public relations firm. The official statement framed the situation as routine verification, a standard governance check triggered by organizational optimization. It was polished, sterile, and deliberately vague. Internally, the messaging was sharper. During a leadership call, Evan dismissed the reassessment as overreaction. Fiona was operational, not strategic. He said, "We've upgraded the role." Upgraded. 14 years of revenue oversight reduced to clerical support. That comment traveled quickly. It reached the board before it reached me. Words matter in corporate governance, especially when 37% of revenue is tied to continuity of expertise. Labeling me operational implied the oversight framework I built required no specialized judgment. Ethan was scheduled to present the revenue risk waterfall model to the board later that week. It was the first time he would explain the structure publicly. I had developed that model over 6 years to map layered exposure across 4 strategic contracts: primary revenue, secondary dependency risk, and tertiary counterparty hedge triggers. It wasn't decorative. It was built to withstand audit scrutiny, according to someone in finance who attended the session. Ethan opened confidently. He clicked through slides. I recognized immediately my formatting, my language, my diagrams. Confidence lasted about 8 minutes. Then a board member asked a simple question. Walk us through the 3-tier exposure hedge if contract 2 underperforms by 10%. It wasn't a trick question. It was foundational. Ethan hesitated. He referenced gross revenue instead of net exposure. He conflated liquidity buffers with contractual risk offsets. He described the tertiary hedge layer as insurance coverage, which it wasn't. It was a structured offset tied to cross-performance clauses in 2 separate agreements. The room grew quiet. Another director leaned forward. Who built this model? Ethan didn't miss a beat. The team. He replied, "Not incorrect, just incomplete." The team had executed calculations. I had designed the structure, calibrated the thresholds, and negotiated the investor covenants tied to those triggers. The distinction wasn't ego, it was accountability. By the end of the presentation, board members weren't angry. They were uncertain. Uncertainty is more dangerous than outrage because it invites verification. The CFO, who had remained outwardly loyal to Evan's narrative, began asking procedural questions. If the investor reassessment escalated, who bore personal certification risk? If representations were deemed incomplete, could individual officers face liability exposure under disclosure statutes? That's when denial began to crack. PR statements can manage headlines. They cannot manage investor compliance reviews. Evan doubled down in private conversations. He insisted that market reaction would stabilize once reassessment concluded. This is optics. He said, it's temporary. But optics don't explain why investor analysts had already requested supporting documentation for continuity assurance. Nor did they explain the mounting discomfort among directors who now recognized a gap between internal expertise and external certification. The shift was subtle but visible. Board members began requesting documentation directly from finance instead of routing questions through Evan. Legal counsel was asked to outline disclosure obligations in writing. The CFO quietly commissioned an internal memo evaluating exposure scenarios tied to key personnel transition. Then the investor group made its next move. They requested an independent third-party risk audit, not an internal review, not supplemental clarification. An external firm. That request reframed everything. Independent audits are not punitive by default, but they are impartial. They evaluate documentation, process adherence, and representation accuracy without allegiance to executive narratives. Evan had attempted to contain the situation through messaging. Now control shifted to documentation, and documentation, once examined by outsiders, rarely bends to spin. Pressure doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in layers, like documentation assembling itself into a case file. When the independent audit firm was formally engaged, the tone inside the company shifted. This was no longer about managing perception or drafting clarifying language. External auditors don't accept narratives. They request records. The firm began with standard protocol organizational charts, delegation matrices, certification trails, and transition documentation. On paper, the leadership change looked simple. A departing executive, a successor appointed. No stated material impact. In practice, It looked incomplete. There was no formal succession plan outlining continuity of oversight for revenue tied to investor covenants. No documented risk impact memo assessing the effect of removing the executive responsible for 37% of total revenue. No transition record showing knowledge transfer sessions, threshold reviews, or signatory recalibration. Those omissions don't immediately imply misconduct, but they do imply exposure. As the audit deepened, questions sharpened, the auditors requested the certification timeline. They examined the date Ethan signed the quarterly revenue statement, declaring no material impact from leadership change. They compared that date to the investor inquiry. Then they requested evidence of any risk reassessment conducted prior to that signature. There was none. Evan maintained composure in meetings, at least outwardly, according to someone present. He leaned back in his chair and dismissed concerns with the same tone he'd used when firing me. She was replaceable. He said, "The structure remains intact. Replaceable. It's a bold word to use when 37% of revenue is formally linked to a named certifying officer in investor filings." One of the auditors responded with measured curiosity rather than confrontation. Then why is 37% of revenue explicitly tied to her investor certification? He asked. The question wasn't accusatory. It was factual. Evan didn't answer immediately. He redirected, speaking about team strength and institutional knowledge. But redirection doesn't satisfy audit inquiry. Auditors follow evidence, not optimism. They requested copies of prior filings for 6 consecutive years. My name appeared under Key Revenue Oversight Certification. My signature validated continuity thresholds embedded in financing agreements. Those agreements weren't symbolic. They governed liquidity buffers, leverage ratios, and covenant compliance. If I was operational, then why was my name embedded in covenants controlling investor exposure, silence? Again, did more damage than argument could have. The audit expanded. They interviewed finance personnel. They requested system logs documenting when executive roles were modified internally. They compared internal deletion timestamps to external filing dates. The gap between termination and disclosure submission was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. Pressure moved outward from governance to individual responsibility. The CFO began asking more pointed questions about officer liability. Legal counsel drafted memos outlining potential disclosure breach implications if intent to delay reporting could be inferred from internal communications. Directors requested private briefings without executive presence. Meanwhile, clients remained steady. Contracts had not faltered. Performance metrics held firm. Operational risk was low. Governance risk was not. Then the audit firm made a request that changed the temperature entirely. They asked to schedule a formal interview with me, not an informal call, not a courtesy check, a recorded, documented interview. The request was procedural, but its implications were unmistakable. They wanted to confirm whether any transition consultation had occurred, whether I had been asked to evaluate continuity impact, whether I had been informed of certification timing. In other words, they wanted to reconcile representation with reality. When my contact inside the audit committee forwarded the notice, I read it twice. There was no hostility in the language, just neutrality. Neutrality can be more dangerous than accusation. Evan had framed my removal as administrative evolution. The audit was now assessing whether that evolution complied with fiduciary obligation. Pressure no longer belonged to the market. It belonged to documentation, and documentation was beginning to speak. What do you think of his decision to call me replaceable, while 37% of revenue carried my certification confidence or carelessness, if you believe that kind of arrogance always writes its own ending? Leave a single period in the comments. When the auditors scheduled my interview, I expected confrontation. What I delivered instead was chronology. I logged into the video session at the appointed time. Camera steady. Tone measured. 2 auditors were present, along with outside counsel representing the company. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone. That wasn't how these things worked. They asked for facts, and I gave them structure. I'll walk you through the timeline. I began. I outlined the termination first. Immediate. No prior written warning, no transition window, my access revoked within hours, no overlap period with my successor. Then I addressed the absence of transition. There was no documented succession plan. I said, no knowledge transfer sessions scheduled, no handoff memorandum summarizing open risk exposures. The auditors nodded, taking notes. I moved to consultation. I was not consulted regarding the impact of my departure on revenue certifications or investor filings. That line mattered, because consultation is the procedural bridge between personnel change and disclosure compliance. Without it, assumptions replace assessment. Finally, I addressed risk review. There was no formal risk impact evaluation conducted with my participation prior to the quarterly certification being signed. I did not speculate. I did not editorialize. I did not mention Evan's directive or Ethan's presentation. I stayed inside my own experience. One of the auditors asked, "Were you asked to evaluate material impact before the certification was filed?" I answered plainly, "No, I was not asked to evaluate impact." Silence followed. But it wasn't tense. It was analytical. Controlled release is different from retaliation. Retaliation seeks damage. Controlled release provides clarity. I understood the distinction. My responsibility was to confirm what had occurred, not to exaggerate what hadn't. The auditors then shifted to documentation. They shared a copy of the quarterly certification Ethan had signed, including the statement declaring no material impact from leadership change. They asked whether I had participated in any review process that would justify that representation. I did not. I said. They asked whether any written assessment had been prepared by my team in advance of the filing. Not to my knowledge. I replied. I could see the logic forming on their side of the screen. If no transition occurred, no consultation took place, and no documented risk review was performed, then the certification asserting no material impact rested on assumption rather than evaluation. Assumptions are fragile in regulated environments. Before ending the session, the auditors clarified one more point. Were you informed of the timing of the certification filing? Number, I said. I learned of it after submission. That distinction closed the loop. I didn't accuse Evan of intent. I didn't characterize Ethan as unqualified. I simply confirmed that process steps required to substantiate a no-impact certification had not occurred with my involvement. After the call ended, I felt something unexpected. Not vindication, not anger, relief. Facts are lighter than resentment. Later that evening, my contact inside finance forwarded a short internal email from the CFO to the executive leadership team. It was concise, stripped of narrative. We may face disclosure exposure. 4 words that shifted the center of gravity. Disclosure exposure does not mean guilt. It means risk tied to representation, accuracy, and timing compliance. It signals that external review has identified a gap between what was represented and what was documented. For the first time, the language inside the company mirrored the language outside it. The issue was no longer market optics or public relations framing. It was compliance alignment. My testimony hadn't attacked anyone. It hadn't needed to. The absence of transition, consultation, and documented risk review spoke on its own. The certification remained on file. The investor reassessment continued. The audit expanded, and somewhere inside the executive floor, the narrative shifted from confidence to containment. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't sought revenge. I had simply confirmed the sequence of events in corporate governance. Sequence is often the difference between judgment and consequence. Market reaction never asks for permission. By the time the investor's reassessment notice filtered through financial media and analyst briefings, the phrase revenue under review had escaped the sterile language of compliance and entered the bloodstream of the market. It appeared in investor summaries, in trading alerts, in cautious analyst notes that never accuse but always imply. The stock dropped another 5%, not a crash, not chaos, just erosion. 5% on top of 6 is no longer volatility. It becomes a pattern. Evan moved quickly to contain it. In a statement circulated internally, and selectively shared with external contacts. He attributed the decline to broader market conditions, macro volatility. He said, sector-wide recalibration. There is always a macro explanation available for executives who prefer abstraction over accountability. But the board was no longer looking at headlines. They were looking at exposure matrices, from what I was told. A closed-door session was held without senior management present. Directors requested side-by-side comparisons, investor notice language, certification timeline, disclosure submission timestamp, and internal correspondence. The question wasn't whether the contracts were safe. They likely were. Clients had not pulled out. Payment schedules remained intact. Operational performance continued as before. The question was governance integrity. One board member, a former regulator, reportedly leaned back in his chair and said what others had been circling around. This is governance failure, not fraud, not collapse. Governance failure. The phrase carries weight. It implies process breakdown, oversight weakness, and leadership misjudgment. It suggests that something preventable was allowed to occur because control mechanisms were either ignored or overridden. Evan's strategy had relied on confidence. Confidence in messaging, confidence in timing, confidence that reassessment would resolve quietly. But governance is not persuaded by confidence. It is persuaded by documentation, as the market digested the news. Institutional analysts began asking secondary questions. Had the board been informed of the delay in disclosure? Was there a formal succession framework? Were signatory authority changes reviewed by compliance before certification filing? Those aren't hostile questions. They are structural. Inside the company, self-preservation began to surface. Directors requested independent legal review separate from executive counsel. The CFO commissioned an exposure memorandum outlining potential implications if regulators deemed the delay in disclosure material. The language shifted again, from reassurance to mitigation. Cold satisfaction is not celebration. It is the quiet recognition that systems, when stressed, reveal where pressure was misapplied. I did not celebrate the stock's decline. Markets punish indiscriminately. Employees feel it. Shareholders feel it. It was not the outcome I wanted, but I recognized the cause. Evan continued to frame the situation as temporary turbulence. In private conversations, he reassured senior managers that the reassessment would conclude without material consequence. He emphasized contract stability and operational continuity. What he could not dismiss was board anxiety. Anxiety doesn't appear on earnings calls, but it moves decisions behind closed doors. Late that afternoon, the audit committee convened separately. They reviewed the audit firm's preliminary findings, the certification timeline, and the internal email instructing delay of disclosure. They assessed fiduciary duty not as theory, but as documented sequence. Then they voted. The motion was simple: initiate a formal internal investigation into executive decision-making surrounding the disclosure delay. It passed. Not unanimously, but decisively. The investigation was not yet public. It did not carry accusation. It carried scrutiny. For the first time, oversight authority shifted away from Evan's narrative control and toward independent examination. The market had reacted. Now governance would respond. And governance, unlike public relations, operates without spin. Confrontation rarely arrives with raised voices. It comes through controlled calls and carefully chosen words. Evan called me late in the afternoon, his number appearing on my screen without warning. I let it ring twice before answering. There was no greeting. "You're destabilizing the company," he said. No inquiry, no acknowledgement of process, just accusation. I kept my tone steady. I didn't delay disclosure. Silence lingered on the line. He exhaled sharply, as if patience were a luxury he no longer had. "You know how markets react." He continued. "Your statements to auditors are amplifying this. My statements were factual." I replied, "Timelines don't amplify themselves." That was the turning point in the conversation. He wasn't asking for clarification. He was asking for correction of perception, not of conduct. Then he made his proposal. We need you to sign a letter confirming there was no adverse operational impact from your departure. It would help close the reassessment. The phrasing was careful. No adverse operational impact, not no material impact. Slightly softer language, slightly safer ground. But words matter in disclosure environments. I can't sign that, I said. Why not? His voice sharpened. Because I was not consulted prior to certification, and no documented transition occurred. I won't validate something I wasn't part of. He shifted tactics. This isn't about ego. Fiona, it's about stabilizing shareholder value. I almost laughed, but I didn't. Shareholder value had not been destabilized by my testimony. It had been destabilized by a delayed disclosure and an unsubstantiated certification. I didn't cause the timing, I said. I'm not responsible for the filing sequence. He paused, recalibrating. You're hurting people who had nothing to do with this. That line was meant to introduce guilt. But accountability is not cruelty. Governance protects those people, I said quietly. Ignoring it doesn't. He ended the call without resolution. Later that evening, Ethan published a post on LinkedIn. It was aspirational, full of phrases like modern leadership, innovation over legacy, and embracing bold change. He framed the transition as evolution, positioning himself as the face of forward-thinking governance. It received predictable engagement, supportive comments from mid-level managers, enthusiastic emojis from business school peers. But the board wasn't scrolling for inspiration. They were reviewing exposure. According to my contact inside finance, directors had grown noticeably less patient with narrative framing. They weren't debating brand tone. They were evaluating fiduciary responsibility. Ethan's post was forwarded internally, with minimal commentary. No one objected publicly, but no one endorsed it either. Silence can signal distance. Meanwhile, legal counsel had begun drafting risk assessments regarding executive representations. The internal lawyer responsible for compliance review circulated a memorandum outlining potential consequences if regulators determined that disclosure timing did not align with certification language. The phrase that stood out in that memo was clear fiduciary breach exposure. Exposure does not mean violation has been proven. It means the possibility must be assessed. That assessment shifted the dynamic again. Evan had tried to contain the situation by framing me as disruptive, by suggesting my cooperation could restore stability, by implying that documentation was flexible if interpreted generously. But internal counsel was no longer interpreting generously. They were analyzing sequence, representation, and duty of care. The board's patience with confrontation began to thin. Directors do not enjoy public reassessment tied to governance language. They especially do not enjoy discovering internal directives that appear to prioritize optics over obligation. I didn't escalate. I didn't retaliate. I didn't publish rebuttals or engage in commentary. I declined to sign. That was all. Sometimes confrontation is not about winning an argument. It's about refusing to rewrite the record. And once fiduciary language enters the conversation, records matter more than personalities. The conflict was no longer personal. It was procedural, and procedures, once tested, reveal exactly where responsibility lives. I wasn't in the room when the board convened for the closed-door session, but by then, information moved with quiet efficiency. Directors had the audit firm's preliminary findings, the internal email instructing delay of disclosure, the certification timeline, and legal counsel's risk memorandum. They also had a market that had shaved double digits off confidence in less than a week. This was no longer about optics. It was about exposure. Company counsel opened the session with restraint. No theatrics, no raised voice, just legal clarity. Failure to disclose timely may constitute material omission. He said. The sentence hung there. Material omission does not imply criminality. It implies that a fact required to make statements not misleading may have been withheld or delayed. In securities environments, that distinction matters. Evan responded immediately. This is exaggerated, he said. The revenue is intact. The contracts are stable. We're dealing with procedural sequencing. Procedural sequencing. It was the same phrase he had used internally when instructing finance to hold the disclosure, the same language he had relied on to frame reassessment as temporary turbulence. But sequencing becomes material when timing affects representation. One director, who rarely spoke without preparation, leaned forward. Was the required disclosure filed within the 72-hour window, tied to key personnel overseeing 37% of revenue? There was no easy reframing of that question. The answer, documented by timestamp, was no. Evan pivoted. We needed to align documentation before triggering unnecessary volatility. That explanation might have worked if the certification had not already been signed, declaring no material impact. But sequence cannot be retroactively corrected by intention. Another board member spoke next. Her tone was calm, almost clinical. Did you prioritize your son over compliance? The room reportedly went silent. It wasn't an accusation of nepotism in the abstract. It was a question of order of operations. Was the promotion executed before the governance implications were assessed? Was certification filed before disclosure was amended? Was optics managed before risk was evaluated? Evan didn't answer immediately. Silence is not just absence of speech. It is acknowledgement of weight. When he did respond, he focused on leadership continuity, innovation, and confidence in Ethan's ability. He emphasized that markets react irrationally and that decisive leadership requires forward movement. None of those arguments addressed fiduciary sequencing. The board wasn't evaluating charisma, it was evaluating duty of care. Legal counsel clarified the stakes. If regulators or investors concluded that disclosure was knowingly delayed after a material personnel change, it could expose the company and potentially individual officers to inquiry. Intent would be examined. Internal correspondence would be reviewed. Representations would be compared against documented actions. Controlled explosion. No one slammed a fist on the table. No one stormed out. But the shift was unmistakable. Directors began asking about indemnification coverage, about insurance triggers, about precedent. Governance had moved from theoretical compliance to personal exposure. Evan attempted one final recalibration. This is about narrative control, he said. If we project instability, we create it. A director responded evenly. Stability does not come from withholding disclosure. That line closed the circle. The vote that followed was procedural, not emotional. The board moved to initiate a formal executive review pending completion of the independent audit and legal assessment. Then came the motion that changed everything. Request that Evan Corin temporarily step aside from active executive authority pending review. Not removal, not termination, temporary separation. But in governance terms, temporary separation signals loss of confidence. The vote was not unanimous, but it carried. Evan was asked to relinquish day-to-day operational control while the investigation concluded. An interim governance structure would be implemented. Authority would shift to a committee oversight model until findings were finalized. The explosion had occurred, not in volume, in consequence. By the time I received confirmation through my contact inside finance, I didn't feel triumph, I felt gravity. Leadership is rarely undone by a single decision. It erodes when process is treated as inconvenience rather than obligation. I had not engineered this outcome. I had not lobbied directors. I had not campaigned for accountability. I had provided timeline. Sequence had done the rest. When governance mechanisms activate, they do so methodically. They isolate variables. They assess exposure. They recalibrate authority. Evan had believed confidence could override compliance. The board believed compliance sustains confidence. And now, authority no longer rested solely in his hands. 2 weeks after the board's closed-door session and Evan's temporary step aside, the Institutional Investor Group issued a formal communication to the board. It was addressed to the directors, not management. Executive confidence materially weakened. That sentence was measured, deliberate, and devastating. Institutional investors rarely use dramatic language. They protect capital through calibrated phrasing. Materially weakened does not accuse. It signals that trust, once stable, has eroded enough to require structural response. By that point, the independent audit had confirmed what timeline had already revealed. Disclosure had been delayed beyond the required window, following a material personnel change tied to 37% of revenue oversight. Certification asserting no material impact had been filed prior to documented risk evaluation. Internal correspondence demonstrated awareness of sequencing risk. There was no fraud finding, no evidence of financial manipulation. The contracts remained intact. Revenue projections had stabilized. This was not collapse by scandal. It was collapse by governance correction. The board convened again, this time without ambiguity. Directors weighed continuity risk not only in contracts, but in leadership credibility. If executive judgment could override disclosure obligations once, investors would assume it could happen again. Ethan's position became untenable first. His resignation letter described the decision as voluntary, framed around allowing the company to move forward without distraction. The phrasing was polite, restrained. He did not admit error. He did not contest the outcome, but no one inside the governance structure mistook the timing. His appointment had been the catalyst. His signature had been the trigger. His lack of preparedness had exposed the gap between confidence and competence. Evan lasted longer, but not by much. The board's formal statement announced that he would step down as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately to facilitate leadership transition and restore investor confidence. There was no public reprimand, no lawsuit, no spectacle, just separation. Markets responded with cautious relief. The stock did not surge, it stabilized. Stability, after weeks of uncertainty, was enough. Inside the company, the atmosphere shifted from tension to recalibration. Interim governance protocols were implemented. Disclosure procedures were tightened. Certification authority was temporarily reassigned to a compliance committee, pending permanent restructuring. The word circulating among directors was simple: correction, governance, correction. It lacked drama. It lacked vengeance. It carried consequence. When I read the board's announcement, I did not feel vindicated. I felt clarity. This outcome was not the result of a campaign. It was the product of sequence meeting oversight. Evan had believed speed would project strength. He had believed narrative would shield timing decisions. He had believed replacing experience with lineage would not materially affect compliance architecture. He had been wrong. A few days after the announcement, I received a call from a board member I had worked with years earlier during covenant renegotiations. His tone was different from any conversation we had ever had. "We'd like to discuss a consulting arrangement," he said. "Independent, focused on revenue oversight stabilization, not reinstatement, not apology. A contract." The proposal was structured as an external advisory engagement, reporting directly to the board's compliance subcommittee. Compensation reflected expertise, not sentiment. It was pragmatic. The mini twist was not revenge. It was recognition. I had been labeled replaceable. Now my knowledge was categorized as essential to restoration. I did not rush to accept. Independence matters. Boundaries matter. But I understood the significance. Justice does not always punish loudly. Sometimes it corrects quietly. No criminal charges were filed. No sensational scandal consumed the company. Employees kept their jobs. Clients kept their contracts. Investors retained their capital. Leadership changed. Process tightened. Confidence, slowly, returned. The collapse had not been explosive. It had been structural, and structures, once realigned, rarely forget the stress that revealed their weakness. Release does not feel like celebration. It feels like alignment. I did not return as an employee. I declined any offer that would place me back under the same executive hierarchy that had dismissed process for convenience. Instead, I signed an independent consulting agreement with the board's compliance subcommittee. The compensation was 3 times my former salary, structured around defined oversight milestones and documentation restoration. It wasn't generosity, it was valuation. My role was clear review the revenue certification framework, re-establish succession protocols, formalize key personnel disclosure triggers, and implement mandatory impact assessments prior to future filings. No ambiguity, no improvisation, just structure. Within weeks, the independent audit concluded. The investor group lifted the reassessment notice. 37% of revenue was formally reconfirmed after updated documentation was submitted. Continuity controls were strengthened, and revised disclosure procedures were approved. The contracts had never been unstable. The governance had been. Evan Corin did not declare bankruptcy. He did not face public disgrace. He stepped down, accepted a negotiated exit, and disappeared from the company's leadership page. In corporate terms, that was consequence enough. He had believed nepotism could override architecture. He had believed confidence could replace compliance. He had believed disclosure law was flexible if managed with enough narrative control. He was wrong. What collapsed was not the business. It was the assumption that personal loyalty ranks above fiduciary duty. I did not need retaliation. I did not need public apology. I did not need the stock to crash or careers to burn. I needed sequence. The law operates without ego. It does not respond to insult. It does not react to arrogance. It responds to documentation and timing. I did not fight the system. I allowed it to function. And when it did, clarity followed. I didn't win because I was louder. I didn't win because I was smarter. I won because I understood something: simple systems matter more than ego. Titles can be taken, access can be revoked, but documentation, process, and integrity outlast personalities. What nearly cost the company 37% of its revenue wasn't incompetence alone. It was the belief that rules are optional when power feels secure. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have signed the letter to keep things calm? Would you have stayed silent to avoid conflict? Or would you have trusted that truth, delivered carefully and without drama, is stronger than spin? These aren't hypothetical questions. Many of you listening have faced moments where speaking up felt risky, even lonely. Where are you listening from tonight? Different cities, different industries, same pressure. If this story resonates with you, it means you understand that doing the right thing isn't always loud, it's steady. If you believe accountability matters, help this message reach someone who needs it. A single subscribe, a comment, a like, or a share can push this story into the feed of someone questioning their own integrity at work. Your small action might remind them that structure protects people, that compliance isn't weakness, and that quiet courage is real power. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.